And so whether it's a man or a woman, they have to meet the same high standards. And Senator, in any place where those things have been eroded or in courses, criteria have been changed in order to meet quotas, racial quotas or gender quotas, that is putting a focus on something other than readiness, standards, meritocracy, and lethality. So that's the kind of review I'm talking about, not whether women have access to ground combat.
Okay.
We are a nation who was founded on the revolutionary truth that all men are created equal, and that our rights come not from man or from government, but from God. And so we will never be indifferent to the suffering of our fellow man. But ultimately, under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State will be the United States.
If you look at how clean natural gas is in the United States compared to other countries and compared to other sources of energy, you'll be stunned at how clean it is. Yet, sometimes this panel and others tend to lump all fossil fuels together and assume that they cannot be provided as part of the energy base load in this country in a clean way.
That's all just ahead in this week's edition of the Illinois Channel.
These women represent diverse viewpoints, from a retired colonel with over 25 years of service to an active duty Navy surface warfare commander to a senior airman. They support Mr. Hegseth and comment on his focus on merit, warfighting readiness, military training status, and the warrior ethos. So without objection, it will be entered into the record. And now I'm honored to recognize Senator Cotton for 7 minutes.
Mr. Hegseth, let's continue on this line of questioning about what's sometimes referred to as women in combat. I think that phrase is something of a misnomer. Many members of this committee have served in combat in the last 25 years, to include women and men. I'm sure all those men served with women, whether they were military police officers or they were pilots, or whether they were intelligence analysts or medics or what have you. You served. I assume you served with women who were on the front lines as well. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And were those women anything other than skilled, brave, and honorable in their service?
They were some of the best soldiers I worked with, Senator.
So women have been serving in combat for a long time. Women have even been serving in combat units like infantry battalions for a long time, in roles like medics or mechanics or what have you. So what we're talking about here specifically is women in ground combat roles, in jobs like infantrymen or artillerymen or special forces. Until about 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. Under Secretary Panetta, those roles were opened up to women to serve in. Has President Trump indicated at all that he plans to rescind or alter that guidance?
You're correct to point out, Senator, that these are the decisions that the Commander-in-Chief will have the prerogative to make. He has not indicated to me that he has plans to change whether or not women would have access to these roles. However, I would point out, ensuring that standards are equal and high is of importance to him and great importance to me. Because in those ground combat roles, what is true is that the weight of the ruck on your back doesn't change. The weight of the 155 round that you have to carry doesn't change. The weight of the 240 Bravo machine gun you might have to carry doesn't change. And so whether it's a man or a woman, they have to meet the same high standards. And Senator, in any place where those things have been eroded or in courses, criteria have been changed in order to meet quotas, racial quotas or gender quotas, that is putting a focus on something other than readiness, standards, meritocracy, and lethality. So that's the kind of review I'm talking about, not whether women have access to ground combat.
Okay, so thank you. So you expect no change to that guidance, but as you point out, in these specific jobs, there are irreducible physical demands. We expect our intelligence analysts and our mechanics to be physically fit in the military, but it's different when you're in the infantry or the artillery. You just mentioned a few things. Let me point it out. An artillery shell weighs almost 100 pounds. An Abrams tank round weighs around 50 pounds. The M240 Bravo machine gun with its tripod weighs almost 50 pounds. The average weight of a full kit, ammo, water, commo, body armor for a soldier is over 100 pounds. Nothing you can do can change any of those things, right? That is physical reality.
Go ahead. Yes, Senator. And I would say the requirements to handle those things in a ground combat unit, as far as standards, can look different than those of a medic or a drone pilot. And so it's not that it has to be the same standard throughout, it's standards to maximize efficacy of that particular position.
Let me read a quote here from one Army officer. While it may be difficult for a 120-pound woman to lift or drag 250 pounds, the Army cannot artificially absolve women of that responsibility. It may still exist on the battlefield. The entire purpose of creating a gender-neutral test was to acknowledge the reality that each job has objective physical standards to which all soldiers should be held, regardless of gender. The intent was not to ensure that women and men will have an equal likelihood of meeting those standards. I assume, based on your testimony, you agree with that Army officer?
Absolutely. The standards need to be the same, and they need to be high, and they need to be set by the people closest to the problem set, closest to the understanding of what is required by that job. Commanders, commanding officers, and COCOMs and elsewhere who understand the reality of what they face, that's the feedback we should get. That's what should be enshrined and enforced, and no other set of political prerogatives. When I talk about removing politics, ideological or political prerogatives should contribute to those determinations, nothing other than the execution of the mission.
Thank you. For the record, that Army officer was Captain Kristen Griest, the Army's first female infantry officer and one of its first female Ranger School graduates. One final point, you said they need to be objective, gender neutral, and high. That's because the demands are, in fact, very high. The current physical fitness test for the Army has a minimum 2-mile run of 22 miles. Run. And I want the reporter to note that I'm putting run in air quotes, because 22 miles at 2 miles is not running. It may be jogging, it's probably walking fast. Let's move on. We've got a big, 22 minutes. We've got a big audience here. Many of them seem to be patriotic supporters of you, Mr. Hegseth. Some of them seem to be liberal critics of you. I would note that it's only the liberal critics that have disrupted this hearing. As was my custom during the Biden administration, I want to give you a chance to respond to what they said about you. I think the first one accused you of being a Christian Zionist. I'm not really sure why that is a bad thing. I'm a Christian. I'm a Zionist. Zionism is that the Jewish people deserve a homeland in the ancient Holy Land where they've lived since the dawn of history. Do you consider yourself a Christian Zionist?
Senator, I'm a Christian, and I robustly support the state of Israel and its existential defense, and the way America comes alongside them is a great ally.
Thank you. Because another protester, and I think this one was a member of Code Pink, which, by the way, is a Chinese Communist front group these days, said that you support Israel's war in Gaza. I support Israel's existential war in Gaza. I assume, like me and President Trump, you support that war as well, don't you?
Senator, I do. I support Israel destroying and killing every last member of Hamas.
And the third protester said something about 20 years of genocide. I assume that's our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you think our troops are committing genocide in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Senator, I do not. I think our troops, as you know, as so many in this committee know, did the best they could with what they had. We're not the outcomes. And tragically, the outcome we saw in Afghanistan under the Biden administration put a stain on that, but it doesn't put a stain on what those men and women did in uniform, as you know full well, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Hegseth.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. At this point, I ask unanimous consent to offer to the record a letter submitted by Omar Abbasi, son of former city council president of Samarra, Iraq, who worked with Mr. Hegseth in Iraq. Without objection, that will be entered. Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hegseth. I do want to thank you for your service, and I want to thank you for your willingness to serve in this capacity.
Thank you, Senator.
I have many concerns about your record, and particularly your public statements, because they are so hurtful to the men and women who are currently serving in the U.S. military, harmful to morale, harmful to good order and discipline. If you are saying that women shouldn't be serving in the military, and I'm going to read you your quotes, because the quotes themselves are terrible. You will have to change how you see women to do this job well, and I don't know if you are capable of that. So I want to press on these issues that my colleague Jean Shaheen brought up, because she said it so well. So first of all, you answered your questionnaire. Do you believe that any American who wants to serve in their country in the military and can meet objective standards set by the military should be allowed to serve without limitation? You've said yes to that question. But then in all of these other circumstances, you've denigrated active duty service members. We have hundreds of women who are currently in the infantry, lethal members of our military serving in the infantry, but you degrade them. You say, we need moms, but not in the military, especially in combat units. So specific to Senator Cotton's question, because Senator Cotton was giving you layups to differentiate between different types of combat. And specifically, as Secretary, would you take any action to reinstitute the combat arms exclusion for female service members, knowing full well you have hundreds of women doing that job right now? And the standards, your 2-mile run, Tom, is about the Army Combat Fitness Test. It is not the requirements to have an MOS 11 Bravo, which is the infantry. These are the requirements today for people serving in the industry, men and women. They are gender neutral, and they are very difficult to meet. They have not been reduced in any way, and our combat units, our infantry is lethal. So please explain specifically, because you will be in charge of 3 million personnel. It is a big job. And when you make these public statements, and I get you were not Secretary of Defense then, I get you were on TV, I get you were helping veterans, I get it was a different job. But most recently, you said this in November of 2024, knowing full well you might have been named as Secretary of Defense. So please explain these types of statements, because they're brutal and they're mean and they disrespect men and women who are willing to die for this country.
Well, Senator, I appreciate your comments, and I would point out I have never disparaged women serving in the military. I respect every single female service member that has put on the uniform, past and present. My critiques, Senator, recently and in the past, and from personal experience, have been instances where I've seen standards lowered, and you mentioned 11 Alpha, 11 Bravo, MOS, places in units, and the book that has been referenced multiple times here, The War on Warriors. I spent months talking to active duty service members, men and women, low ranks, high ranks, combat arms and not combat arms. And what each and every one of them told me, and which personal instances have shown me, is that in ways direct, indirect, overt, and subtle, standards have been changed inside infantry training units, ranger school, infantry battalions, to ensure that
Give me one example. Please give me an example. I get you're making these generalized
commanders meet
statements.
quotas to have a certain number of female infantry officers or infantry enlisted, and that disparages those women
Commanders
who are
do
incredibly
not have to
capable
meet
of meeting
quotas
that
for the
standard.
infantry. Commanders do not have to have a quota for women in the infantry. That does not exist. It does not exist. And your statements are creating the impression that these exist, because they do not. There are not quotas. We want the most lethal force. But I'm telling you, having been here for 15 years, listening to testimony about men and women in combat and the type of operations that were successful in Afghanistan and in Iraq, women were essential for many of those units. When Ranger units went in to find where the terrorists hiding in Afghanistan or in Iraq, if they had a woman in the unit, they could go in, talk to the women in a village, say, where are the terrorists hiding? Where are the weapons hiding? And get crucial information to make sure that we can win that battle. So you cannot denigrate women in general, and your statements do that. We don't want women in the military, especially in combat. What a terrible statement. So please, do not deny that you've made those statements. You have. We take the responsibility of standards very seriously, and we will work with you. I'm equally distressed you would not meet with me before this hearing. We could have covered all of this before you came here, so I could get to the 15 other questions that I want to get to. So women you have denigrated. You have also denigrated members of the LGBTQ community. Did you know that when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in place, we lost so many crucial personnel, over 1,000 in mission-critical areas. We lost 10% of all our foreign language speakers because of a political policy. You said in your statement, you don't want politics in the DOD. Everything you've said in these public statements is politics. I don't want women. I don't want moms. What's wrong with a mom, by the way? Once you have babies, you therefore are no longer able to be lethal. I mean, you're basically saying women, after they have children, can't ever serve in the military in a combat role. It's a silly thing to say. It's a silly thing to say, beneath the position that you are aspiring to. To denigrate LGBTQ service members is a mistake. If you are a sharpshooter, you're as lethal regardless of what your gender identity is, regardless of who you love. So please know this to be a true statement. So you say it was a political thing. You say it undermined us, social engineering. I don't know why someone having to publicly say or not publicly say who they love is social engineering. I think having that policy in the first place was highly problematic. And as you said in your statement, do you agree anybody should be able to serve in the military if they meet the standards?
Senator, as the president has stated, I don't disagree with the overturn of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Great, because I don't want you thinking, can't serve if you're a mom, can't serve if you're LGBTQ, and then last, can't serve if you're a leftist. The statements you said about people who have views differently than you, that we're the enemy, are you saying that 50% of the DOD, if they hold liberal views or leftist views or are Democrats, are not welcome in the military? Are you saying that?
Senator, I volunteered to deploy to Afghanistan under Democrat President Barack Obama. I also volunteered to guard the inauguration of Joe Biden, but was denied the opportunity to serve because I was identified as an extremist by my own unit for a Christian tattoo.
Thank you very much. Senator Gillibrand, you held up a document and referred to it during your questioning. Would you like that entered into the record?
Maybe one without my marks.
Okay, okay, we'll delete.
We'll submit a clean
it up.
copy.
Without objection, that will be admitted at the point of your question. And I would like to enter into the record at this point a letter of support from retired Air Force Colonel Melissa Cunningham. Colonel Cunningham supports Mr. Hegseth and mentions his warrior ethos, combat effectiveness, and maintaining military training standards. So without objection, both of those will be admitted, and I now recognize Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, good morning. I'd like to thank you for your service to our nation in uniform and also your work on behalf of your fellow veterans and for your willingness to enter into this maelstrom of public service. I think the presence of so many veterans who have showed up to support you speaks volumes. I also want to recognize your family's service and sacrifice. You know as well as anyone that it's not just the man that enters the arena, but it's the entire family who also works their way through this process as well. I appreciated our meeting with you and with your wife Jennifer this last month. I thought that we had an excellent conversation, and I appreciate your statement and your answers to the advanced policy questions, especially your desire to bring a renewed focus on warfighting and lethality back to the Pentagon. I also respect and I appreciate my friend and colleague, Senator Gillibrand, and some of her questions, and I know that she had a number of them in there. You had an opportunity to respond very briefly. Were there any other responses that you would like to make or clarifications that you would like to make before I move on to my questions?
Senator, thank you very much for the opportunity to meet and for the question. I would also acknowledge you were mentioning female engagement teams, which have shown a great deal of success on the battlefield. It would be and universally acknowledged as such. I've been in Iraqi homes where the language and gender barrier was real, and the ability to have someone there to help in that process would be a massive accelerant in mission success. So I recognize that reality. I also recognize that female engagement teams assigned to a SEAL team or a Green Beret team meet different standards also, which is okay because of the duty positions involved in that job. As far as politics, Senator, it has been the joy of my life to lead men and women in military outfits. When you're in combat or in training, there's a lot of conversations that happen. And you start to realize that a lot of people you're serving with share your political ideals or they don't. You find out there's Republicans, there's Democrats, there's Libertarians, there's Independents, there's Vegetarians, everything in between. None of that matters. It never mattered in how I led men and women, how I interacted with them, what missions we undertook. Politics has nothing to do with the battlefield, which is why President Trump has asked me to say, let's make sure all of that comes out. This is about warfighting capability, setting standards high, and making sure we give our boys, our men and women, everything they need to be successful on the battlefield. So politics can play no part in that, and I look forward to infusing that, as we always have inside our units.
I appreciate you making that very clear. And one of the areas that we want to do our best is to provide for the equipment and the technical capabilities so that no young man or woman enters into a battle as a fair fight, and that they always have the advantage. Those are the types of questions that I'd like to get into right now, and I want to start by talking about something that sometimes gets a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's critical. Mr. Hegseth, from what I've heard from 24 senior DoD officials in hearings over the last 2 years, including the Secretary of Defense, every service chief, and 8 combatant commanders, is that sharing the portion of the spectrum, and this is in the weeds, I know, but I'm going to ask it to get it on the record, the 3.1 to 3.5 gigahertz band would have extremely serious consequences and very costly consequences on our warfighting capabilities. In fact, the Department of the Navy alone has estimated that relocating their systems to a different part of the spectrum band would cost them $250 billion. That's just for the destroyers that defend our coasts with the radars that they have in them. If confirmed, what will you do to make sure that the Department of Defense can maintain its access to and the use and to be able to maneuver within the electromagnetic spectrum at home and abroad? And would you be willing to literally go to the mat with the interagency to protect warfighter requirements for the use of the spectrum?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. And my job, in part, will be to go to the mat when necessary for things I believe are an absolute requirement for the Department of Defense and the men and women in uniform. There's no doubt about that. In this particular case, as far as spectrum, I look forward, as I've said before, getting a full class of, because this issue has come up a number of times in meetings. It's critically important with how our warfighters communicate across all services. So I'm going to get a classified briefing immediately about what that would, how it would impact the spectrum if it were to allow other companies or it to be
Rest
auctioned
assured,
off.
China
So we have
would
to know.
China would love to have our ability to use that part of the spectrum restricted. They would
And
love that.
Absolutely right. And so I will go in with eyes only toward ensuring we have the capabilities we need and there's no disruption when I take that brief.
Thank you. In your advanced policy questions, you recognize a cooperative approach by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea to undermine U.S. influence around the world. As you point out, aggression by any one actor would be an opportunity for others to engage the U.S. on multiple fronts along the continuum of the conflict. As we discussed in my office, neither of us wants to send our troops into a fair fight. We want to make sure that they have every advantage that the United States can give them, and that requires resources and reforms. Given the growing potential of a multi-theater conflict involving near-peer adversaries, what steps would you take to prepare the Department of Defense to simultaneously execute and sustain operations across multiple regions while maintaining readiness and deterrence globally? And I just have to make note, and I want to make it clear, we have language in this year's fiscal year 2025 National Defense Authorization Act calling for a review of the department's operational plans. And I just want to make sure that you're aware of that, and that we will have, if we have a fight with one, the chances are very good that we're going to have two battles or two different battlegrounds at the same time.
Senator, which is why I believe our country's incredibly fortunate to have a new commander-in-chief in Donald Trump, who through the strategic approach he has taken with allies and against foes has prevented wars and is determined to do the same. That's our chief job, is deter and prevent wars. My job, should I be confirmed at the Secretary of Defense, is to ensure we have the right prioritization of assets and strategy, and then the tools in the toolbox necessary, the pointiest possible spear for President Trump to wield if necessary as the last resort. So President Trump at the helm, I think, will go a long way in making sure our enemies know there's a new sheriff in town.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for being here, Mr. Hegseth. And I want to join in expressing appreciation and respect for your service to our country. And thanks to all the veterans who are here today. And thank you for your service as the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee. I hope we can focus on doing better for our veterans and doing better in management of the Department of Defense. There's always room for improvement. I think what we need in that position is not just better, but the best in financial management, because those decisions are life and death decisions affecting the 3.4 million Americans who serve our national security and our national defense and put their lives on the line. I want to talk about financial mismanagement at the two organizations that you headed, which are the only test of your financial management that we have before this committee, the Veterans for Freedom and Concerned Veterans for America. You took over the Veterans for Freedom in 2007. In 2008, you raised $8.7 million, but spent more than $9 million, creating a deficit. By January 2009, you told donors that the organization had less than $1,000 in the bank and debts of $434,000. By 2010, revenue at the Veterans for Freedom had dropped to about $265,000. In the next year, it had dropped further to $22,000. You don't dispute these numbers, do you?
Senator, I'm extremely proud of the work me and my fellow vets did at Vets for Freedom. A bunch of young vets with no political experience, a small group, working hard every single day. We raised donor funds. And and we have letters submitted for the record from almost everyone that worked with me every single day, including our chief operating officer, who will attest that every dollar we raised was used intentionally toward the execution of our mission, which is supporting the warfighters, exactly why we're here today, the warfighters in the Iraq surge. There was a campaign in 2008, Senator. It was Barack Obama versus John McCain.
Ask you another
we believe
question,
John McCain would be the right person to win, and so we spent
the tax
more.
returns from that organization.
I'm glad they're for the record.
I'm going to ask to be entered into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
These tax returns are yours. They have your signature. And I'm going to ask that members of the committee review them because they're the only documents. I've asked for others. I've asked for the FBI report that would presumably document, it should have documented, this kind of financial mismanagement. And these are the 990s from that organization. By the year of 2011, donors had become so dissatisfied with that mismanagement, they, in effect, ousted you. They merged that organization with Military Families United, and thereafter, you joined a second organization as executive director.
In between, Senator, I went to Harvard University for 2 years and Afghanistan.
I want to ask you questions about Concerned Veterans for America. Again, another set of tax returns, the 990s from that organization. I ask they be made part of the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, both of those returns are now part of the record.
2011 to 2016. At the end of 2013, shortfall of $130,000. At the end of 2014, shortfall of $428,000. You had a surplus the following year, but then another deficit of $437,000. By the time you left, that organization had deep debts, including credit card transaction debts of about $75,000. That isn't the kind of fiscal management we want at the Department of Defense. We can't tolerate it at the Department of Defense. That's an organization with a budget of $850 billion, not 10 or 15 million, which was the case at those two organizations. And it has command responsibility for 3.4 million Americans. The highest number that you managed in those two organizations was maybe 50 people. Let me ask you, how many men and women now serve in the United States Army? What is Zen strength?
Senator, I would like an opportunity to respond to
Well,
the
I've asked you a
impugning of
question.
my leadership of a
How many men
veterans
and women
organization. Concerned
currently
Veterans for
serve?
America, you're on the VA committee, sir, and I appreciate your service there. The VA Accountability Act and the Mission Act were all brainchilds of Concerned Veterans for America. We used our donor money very intentionally and focused to create policy that bettered the lives of veterans.
Mr. Hegseth, I'm asking you a very simple question. How many men and women currently serve in the United States Army?
Senator, the United States Army, 450,000 on active duty, sir.
And how many in the Navy?
And the Navy is 425, sir.
Well, it's 337 this year. How many in the Marine Corps?
175,000, sir.
172,300. Those numbers dwarf any experience you had by many multiples. I don't believe that you can tell this committee or the people of America that you are qualified to lead them. I would support you as the spokesperson for the Pentagon. I don't dispute your communication skills, but I believe that we are entitled to the facts here. I've asked for more documents. I assume you'd be willing to submit to an expanded FBI background check that interviews your colleagues, accountants, ex-wives, former spouses, sexual assault survivors, and others, and enable them to come forward.
Senator, I'm not in charge of FBI background checks.
But you would submit to it and support it.
I'm not in charge of FBI background checks.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I at this point, want to submit a letter from Captain Wade Zirkle, the founder of Vets for Freedom and the person who hired Pete Hegseth to run the organization. Although the 2008 financial crisis dried up fundraising for nonprofits, Captain Zirkle says, and I quote, "Pete responded to this crisis with decisive action by reducing staff and renegotiating all debts with creditors until they were fairly resolved, an impressive feat and a testament to Pete's character." Pete departed VFF in 2010 to take on a new role with Concerned Veterans for America. Pete departed on good terms. Without objection, that will be added to the record. Senator Ernst, you are recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter submitted by Mr. Mark Lucas, who is a fellow Iowan and Iowa Army National Guard member. Mr. Lucas and I served together in the Iowa Army National Guard. He succeeded Pete Hegseth as Executive Director of Concerned Veterans for America. And in his letter, Mr. Lucas says that Mr. Hegseth, quote, laid a strong foundation that postured CVA for long-term success, end quote. And that Mr. Hegseth, quote, continued to be an invaluable asset to both me as a leader and the organization, end quote. So I would ask for unanimous consent to enter this Washington Times article and the letter from Mr. Mark Lucas into the record.
Without objection.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Hegseth, and thank
morning,
you very
Senator.
much. I appreciate your service to our nation. It's something that I know you are very proud of, and it is something that we have in common and that we share. You and I have had many productive conversations. And just for our audience, we have had very frank conversations. Is that correct, Mr. Hegseth?
Senator, that is a correct characterization.
You know that I don't keep anything hidden, pull no punches. My colleagues know that as well. So I do appreciate you sitting down and allowing me the opportunity to question you thoroughly on those issues that are of great importance to me. Just to recap those issues, three that are very important. One is the DOD and making sure that we have a clean audit. The second is women in combat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And the third was maintaining high standards and making sure that we are combating sexual assault in the military. Okay, so Mr. Hegseth, I'm going to address the issue because this will tie into some of the financial concerns that have been raised here as well. And it's why, you know, I, trusting my fellow Iowan, asked for unanimous consent of his letter to go into the record. But like me, a lot of Iowans are really, really concerned and upset about the wasteful Washington spending and of course, in our Pentagon. It's an issue that I have been combating for years. So there's significant room for greater efficiency and cost cutting within the department. And the DOD is the only federal agency that has never passed an audit. As the Senate DOJ caucus chair and founder, that's unacceptable to me, and it should be unacceptable to you as well. So I appreciate that you mentioned that in your opening statement. What are those steps that you will take to ensuring the Pentagon has a clean audit by the year 2028?
Senator, I appreciate your work on this topic, which you've been involved in for a long time. You mentioned Concerned Veterans for America. I just want to clarify. We have very generous donors who set a very clear budget that we stuck to every single year. So the latitude there was restricted, and we worked very hard and diligently inside it. You've also been a leader on the Pentagon audit for a very long time. I think when we met, Senator, I said 2014 was the first year. We discovered a 2013 op-ed I wrote about the need for a Pentagon audit because an audit is an issue of national security and frankly, respect to American taxpayers who give $850 billion over to the Defense Department and expect that we know where that money goes. And if that money is going somewhere that doesn't add to tooth and instead goes to fat or tail, we need to know that. Or if it's wasted, we need to know that. So I think previous secretaries of defense, with all due respect, haven't necessarily emphasized the strategic prerogative of an audit. And myself, my deputy SecDef, and others already know that a Pentagon audit will be the comptroller, others central to ensuring we find those dollars that can be used elsewhere legally under the law inside the Pentagon. So you have my word, it will be a priority.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to women in combat, and I had the privilege of serving in uniform for over 23 years. Between our Army Reserves and our Iowa Army National Guard, did serve in Kuwait and missions in Iraq. And so it is incredibly important that I stress, and I hope that if confirmed, you continue to stress, that every man and woman has opportunity to serve their country in uniform and do so at any level, as long as they are meeting the standards that are set forward. And we talked about that in my office. I do believe in high standards. Now, I was denied the opportunity to serve in any combat role because I have a lot of gray hair. And the policy has changed since then, okay? So I've been around for quite a while. But for the young women that are out there now and can meet those standards, and again, I'll emphasize they should be very, very high standards. They must physically be able to achieve those standards so that they can complete their mission. But I want to know, again, let's make it very clear for everyone here today. As Secretary of Defense, will you support women continuing to have the opportunity to serve in combat roles?
Senator, first of all, thank you for your service, as we discussed extensively as well.
It's my privilege.
And my answer is yes, exactly the way that you caveated it. Yes, women will have access to ground combat roles, given the standards remain high, and we'll have a review to ensure the standards have not been eroded in any one of these cases. That'll be part of one of the first things we do at the Pentagon, is reviewing that in a gender-neutral way, the standards, ensuring readiness and meritocracy is front and center. But absolutely, it would be the privilege of a lifetime if confirmed, to be the Secretary of Defense for all men and women in uniform who fight so heroic. They have so many other options. They decide to put their right hand up for our country, and it would be an honor to have a chance to lead them.
Thank you. And just very briefly, we only have less than a minute left, but we have also discussed this in my office. A priority of mine has been combating sexual assault in the military and making sure that all of our service members are treated with dignity and respect. This has been so important. Senator Gillibrand and I have worked on this, and we were able to get changes made to the Uniform Code of Military Justice to make sure that we have improvements and on how we address the tragic and life-altering issues of rape, sexual assault. It will demand time and attention from the Pentagon under your watch if you are confirmed. So as Secretary of Defense, will you appoint a senior level official dedicated to sexual assault prevention and response?
Senator, as we have discussed, yes, I will.
Okay, and my time has expired.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.
149-year history of our republic, there's only been 71 other Americans who have served in the role and the position that President Trump has now nominated me to occupy. And I want to thank him for his confidence, and it's an incredible honor. It is also, as many of you have already pointed out, an extraordinary responsibility. 3 of my children, Amanda, Anthony, and Dominic, could not be here with us today or join us here in person. The path that brings me to this moment was paved by those who are not here with us today, by 2 parents who arrived here on May 27th of 1956 from Cuba, and they had nothing but the dreams of a better life. And because of them, I had the privilege to be born a citizen of the greatest nation in the history of mankind, and to be raised in a safe and stable home by parents who made their children's future the very purpose of their lives. I also want to acknowledge all the blessings that God has bestowed upon me in my life. My faith is critical and something I will lean and rely on heavily in the months that are ahead. In a tumultuous world where, in my faith, we are called to promote the cause of peace and the common good. And that task has gotten harder than it's ever been. And I will rely heavily on my faith and pray for God's blessings, that He will provide me the strength, the wisdom, and the courage to do what is right in these tenuous moments. At the end of the Second World War, the United States was, in the words of then Secretary of State, tasked with creating an order, a world order, a free half, as he quote in his quote, out of chaos, without blowing to pieces, without blowing the whole of the world into pieces in the process. And in the decades that followed, that global order served us quite well. Americans' incomes rose and communities flourished. Alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and Europe that led to the emergence of stability and democracy and prosperity. Alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe that led to the emergence of stability, democracy, and prosperity, but it also prevented a cataclysmic world war. And ultimately, a wall in Berlin came down, and with it, an evil empire. Out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus. And this consensus was that we had reached the end of history, that all of the nations of the world would now become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon national sovereignty and national identity and would instead become one human family and citizens of the world. This wasn't just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion. Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed our industrial capacity, and has pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and of rivals. An irrational zeal for maximum freedom of movement of people has resulted in a historic mass migration crisis here in America, but also around the world. It's one that threatens the stability of societies and of governments. Across the West, governments now censor and even prosecute domestic political opponents. Meanwhile, radical jihadists openly march in the streets and sadly drive vehicles into our people. While America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continue to act the way countries always have. So while America too often prioritized the global order above our core national interests, other nations continued to act the way nations have always acted and always will, in what they perceive to be their best interest. And instead of folding into the post-Cold War global order, they have manipulated it to serve their interests at the expense of ours. We welcomed the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits, and they ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country. In our very own hemisphere, narco-terrorists and dictators and despots take advantage of open borders to drive mass migration, to traffic in women and children, and to flood our communities with deadly fentanyl and violent criminals. In Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, dictators, rogue states now sow chaos and instability and align with and they fund radical terror groups. And then they hide behind their veto power at the United Nations Security Council or the threats of nuclear war. The post-war global order is not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us. And all this has led to a moment in which we must now confront the single greatest risk of geopolitical instability and of generational global crisis in the lifetime of anyone alive and in this room today. 8 decades later, we are once again called to create a free world out of the chaos. And this will not be easy. And it will be impossible without a strong and a confident America that engages in the world, putting our core national interests once again above all else. Just 4 years ago, I believe we began to see the outlines and the beginnings of what that would look like. During President Trump's first term, American strength was a deterrent to our adversaries, and it gave us leverage in diplomacy. There were no new wars. ISIS was eviscerated. Soleimani was dead. The historic Abraham Accords were born, and Americans were safer as a result. Now, President Trump returns to office with an unmistakable mandate from the voters. They want a strong America engaged in the world, but guided by a clear objective to promote peace abroad and security and prosperity here at home. That is the promise that President Trump was elected to keep. And if I am confirmed, keeping that promise will be the core mission of the United States Department of State. Now, tragically, horrifying atrocities and unimaginable human suffering can be found on virtually every continent. And I am certain that today I will be asked about the array of programs and the activities the Department of State carries out to address them. We are a nation who was founded on the revolutionary truth that all men are created equal, and that our rights come not from man or from government, but from God. And so we will never be indifferent to the suffering of our fellow man. But ultimately, under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State will be the United States. The direction he has given for the conduct of our foreign policy is clear. Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, every policy we pursue must be justified by the answer to one of three questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Or does it make America more prosperous? Under President Trump, the dollars of hardworking American taxpayers will always be spent wisely, and our power will always be yielded prudently and towards what is best for America and Americans before anything and everything else. Prudence in the conduct of foreign policy is not an abandonment of our values. It is the common sense understanding that while we remain the wealthiest and the most powerful nation on the earth, our wealth has never been unlimited and our power has never been infinite. And placing our core national interest above all else is not isolationism. It is the common sense realization that a foreign policy centered in our national interests is not some outdated relic. Since the emergence of the modern nation state over 2 centuries ago, countries acting based on what they perceive to be their core national interests, that has been the norm, not the exception. And for our country, placing the interest of America and Americans above all else has never been more relevant or more necessary than it is right now. For in the end, how can America promote the cause of peace on earth if it is not first safe at home? What good is America to our allies if it is not strong? And how can America help end the suffering of God's children across the world if it is not first prosperous here at home? I thank you, and I hope I can earn your support, whether it's because you believe I will do a good job or because you want to get rid of me. Thank you.
Either way, the result's the same. Thank you, Senator Rubio. I've always been impressed with your view, particularly on a 50,000-foot level, of the kind of problems that we face in our lane and national security lane, foreign relations and intelligence. So appreciate those remarks. We're now going to start a round. I'm going to allow 10-minute questions since this is a cabinet level position. That doesn't mean you have to use all 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes are there. And what I'm going to do in this hearing and what I'm going to do in future hearings is I will call on people based on seniority on the committee at the time the gavel goes down. And if you come after that, you'll be put in line after that, and we'll go down the list like that. In any event, with that, Senator Rubio, could you talk for a minute about the Russian energy reliance? I think all of us were impressed when the war started that the Europeans knew the necessity of cutting the cord with Russia on their reliance on Russian energy, which had developed since the Iron Curtain came down, all of us believing that Russia would behave itself, which turned out to be a very misplaced view. And now, with the war carrying on, it's going to end, obviously, at some point in time. There are voices in Europe saying, well, we can go back to using Russian energy. My view is that that's not reasonable and it's not appropriate. And indeed, I think that the fallout from this war is going to go on for generations. Your thoughts on the energy relationship between Europe and Russia in the future?
Well, I'm reminded, I believe back in 2018, then President Trump, on 2 occasions, once at the United Nations and I think another time at a NATO conference, pointed, for example, to Germany's reliance on Russian energy as a real vulnerability. And he was snickered at. I remember he was snickered at by the representatives of Germany at the United Nations. He turned out to be 100% correct. In fact, that reliance on Russian energy was a major loss of deterrence. Vladimir Putin, among his many calculations, one of the calculations he took in going in Ukraine was that the Europeans would complain, maybe they'd hit him with a couple sanctions, they'd write some strongly worded nasty letters about him, but ultimately would not be able to do anything effectively because of how much they depended on Russia. And in some cases continue to depend. I believe France is the 3rd leading payer into Russian energy in the world, and I think a couple other countries in Europe follow right behind. So there's still a significant amount of dependence in that regard. And that dependence on Russian energy is a tremendous amount of leverage that Vladimir Putin holds on his neighbors in Europe. Now, there is some good news. I think, for example, I watched with great interest the German engineering marvel, where they've been able to, I think at the end of this year, after they waived permitting requirements, and within 9 months, were able to open what is literally a floating LNG terminal to allow and receive exports, including from the United States and other places. So I do think you're seeing movement in Europe now to try to detangle itself from that level of dependence, but it remains a real vulnerability and a tremendous piece of leverage for Putin against his neighbors in the broader world. It's also a reminder, by the way, and I used to be guilty of saying this quite a bit, that the Russian GDP was the size of Italy's, not very large. I think one of the things we learned from this endeavor is that it's not just the size of the GDP, but what it's composed of. And the Russian GDP, while smaller than some other countries, is largely reliant on the production of raw materials, on the energy, on food production, fertilizer and the like. And these are critical components of national strength and a reminder of how important they are for us here domestically as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do think, too, we ought to acknowledge that the Europeans did a job that was well beyond our expectations the first winter. As they struggled through, they did really well as far as cutting the cord with Russia, being as how hard they were tied to that. Let's talk about AUKUS for a minute. There hasn't been much discussion about AUKUS. Well, there hasn't been much discussion about AUKUS really since the thing started. A lot of us have been pressing the administration to gear that up. It has not been forthcoming. I'd like to hear your thoughts on AUKUS, the importance thereof, and getting this thing moving as it was intended.
Well, one of the things we'll have to endeavor to see, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of this that relies on the Department of Defense and other entities in government. To the extent the Secretary of State and the Department of State is engaged, it's something that I think you're going to find very strong support for in this administration. Because it's one of, I think it's almost a blueprint in many ways of how we can create consortium-like partnership with nation states that are allied to us to confront some of these global challenges, be it in the defense realm, in the technology realm, in the critical minerals realm, in the sensitive technologies and critical technologies on, for example, artificial intelligence and advances in even quantum computing. This obviously is more defense related, but it's one example of how we can leverage the power of these partnerships with allies, 2-3 countries in some cases, broader in others, to reach outcomes and objectives, such as creating a geopolitical and strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. So we'll have to look at that and to see what components of whatever impediments exist can be removed by the action of the Department of State. But it also reminds us that in many of these, very few of these global issues are entirely reliant on the Department of State. The Department of Energy, the Department of Defense. We have a host of other government agencies, commerce in many cases, who also play a critical role in expediting and going through, for example, some of the lists of technologies that perhaps are not being transferred because they've been deemed as sensitive. But in the case of our strong and close allies, that's the point, right? Is that you want to be able to find yourself in a situation where you can accelerate partnership by making available to key allies these sensitive technologies that we wouldn't want to see in the hands or developed by an adversary or an aligned country.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And our view is aligned, particularly on the excluded technology list. These are our closest and most trusted allies. And unfortunately, the current administration has really been difficult to work with as far as getting through that excluded technology list. And I hope you'll help expedite that. Let me talk for a minute about the International Criminal Court. Look, as you know, we've got real problems there. The court originally was intended, at least from our point of view, to be a court that focused on international crimes that were committed by people from countries who did not have a robust democracy nor a robust judicial system that held its own people accountable for crimes. The court's gone beyond that, obviously. They are not only focusing on people who aren't accountable elsewhere, but they're also focusing on people who come from countries that solve their own problems, like the United States of America and like Israel. The most recent obvious thing that flowed from that was the indictment on the same day of Netanyahu plus a Hamas character. Any court that is a court of law has to be able to recognize good from bad. And when you try to indict two people and show some type of moral equivalency in that regard, they're just barking up the wrong tree. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to rein them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the ICC has done tremendous damage to its global credibility. First of all, it is going after a non-member state on the claims that I believe, in fact, I think just in the last 24 hours, the Israeli High Court filed an appeal before the ICC, even though it's not a member state. And I saw some of the filings from the prosecutor, Mr. Khan, was involved in that process. And he argues that they have the right to go after non-members for their activities within the confines of member states in this case. And I think, first of all, the whole premise of his prosecution is flawed, beyond the process of it and the precedent that it sets, which is a very dangerous precedent for the United States of America, by the way, because this is a test run. This is a trial run to see, can we go after a head of state from a nation that's not a member? If we can go after them and we can get it done with regards to Israel, they will apply that to the United States at some point. And in fact, there have been threats to do so in the past. But the premise of the prosecution itself is completely and utterly flawed. As you said, they went ahead, I think they also went after Sinwar. Well, number one, Sinwar didn't travel around the world. He's not with us any longer. But he didn't travel around the world, was at no risk of being apprehended. Second of all, the moral equivalency piece of it was offensive. Let me explain, and I think I don't need to explain to this committee. Hamas carried out an atrocious operation. They sent a bunch of savages into Israel with the express and explicit purpose of targeting civilians. They went into concerts. They went into these music festivals. They knew that there were no soldiers at the music festival. They knew that these were teenagers and young families, that they went into different communities and the kibbutzes and the like, and they deliberately targeted civilians. Deliberately. It was in fact, they kidnapped the ones they didn't murder, the families who they didn't eviscerate, the people whose skulls they didn't crack open. They kidnapped, and to this day continue to hold people, innocents that they took. A deliberate operation. In the case of Israel, responding to that attack has had to go after Hamas. How can you coexist? How can any nation state on the planet coexist side by side with a group of savages like Hamas? They have to defend their national security and their national interest, as I pointed out in my opening statement. And so there is no more, and they didn't target civilians. Now, sadly and unfortunately, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further, some of the other questions that will come up here today, one of the horrible things about war, it's a terrible thing about war, and it's why we should try to prevent it at almost any cost, is that innocent people are caught up in it. And that's true of every conflict on the planet. But there is a difference between those who, in the conduct of armed action, deliberately target civilians, and those who do as much as they can to avoid civilians being caught up against an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, against an enemy that hides in tunnels, against an enemy that hides behind women and children, and puts them at the forefront and uses them as human shields. That's who Hamas is. There is no moral equivalency, and I think the ICC, if they don't drop this, will find its credibility globally badly damaged, and I think the United States should be very concerned, because I believe this is a test run for applying it to American service members and American leaders in the future.
Well said. I couldn't agree with you more, and certainly the court has badly damaged its reputation, and it's going to have a long ways to go to recover from that. So with that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rubio, as I said in my opening statement, I hope that this committee can better collaborate to swiftly confirm career Foreign Service officers. These are patriotic Americans who have served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, and they work to advance U.S. national security interests. Delays and vacant posts hurt America's interest. I know you agree with that because we've had that conversation. But will you commit to working with Chairman Risch and me to prioritize the advancement and confirmation of career State Department officials?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but I would also point to this fact that I think we're going to begin by prioritizing. We're going to look at what are the key issues in the world. Obviously, every post in the world is important or it shouldn't exist. And then the question is, which are the ones we bring to you first? And those are the ones that I think are most critical. So obviously, I think you'll see our nominees for the deputy posts, which are critically important, all the undersecretaries as well. And what I've endeavored to do is we interview and identify people, and I believe I've met with and interviewed most of the candidates for those top posts, is I want to bring you people that are three things. Number one, are aligned to the mission. I think that's critically important, whether they be foreign service officers. I'm not talking about political alignment. I'm talking about alignment with the mission that we've outlined for American foreign policy, which is one of the things that I think has hurt the State Department under numerous administrations, is sometimes the mission, or what it is the core mission of the department has not been well defined. So that's on us, and it's our obligation to define that. So number one, aligned to the mission. Number two, the capability to do the job. And I can tell you now that in my entire service on this committee, which spans 14 years, we always had fellows from the Department of State, I believe all of whom are still in the service of our country. And I intend, because I know them and I've worked with them, to utilize their skill sets in the department. And in fact, a couple who we hope will be returning home soon from foreign postings to work with us at the State Department closer to my office. But the point is that we want to have people that are highly capable, both those who we bring from what they call political appointees, but also those that are promoted from within the Foreign Service. And then the third are people that we can get through the committee, because time is of the essence. Now, you may not agree with all their views, whether they be Foreign Service officers or whether they be political, but I think it's important and we're not going to exclude someone just because we think that maybe they're going to have a rougher confirmation process than someone else. But I do think it's important that we have people in these positions as quickly as possible, and having served for 14 years on that side of this room, I understand that one of the things we can do to help expedite that is to bring you people that will do a good job, who are qualified for the job or mission aligned, but also that can move through this process quickly enough so that they can be at post and begin to fulfill their duties. If I have to wait a year to get them in place, well, I'm not sure on some of these issues we face today, we have a year to wait.
I certainly agree with that, and I appreciate your focus on mission and qualifications, because I think the committee will be looking closely at that. I want to go now to NATO, because in 2023, Congress overwhelmingly passed the bipartisan Kane-Rubio provision prohibiting any president from withdrawing the United States from NATO without Senate approval or an act of Congress. Will you commit to adhering to Senate approval or an act of Congress as required under that law that you authored if President Trump attempts to withdraw the U.S. from NATO?
Well, first let me say that President Trump has appointed an ambassador nominee for NATO, which clearly indicates his role to engage in that. Second is, the law is what it is. Obviously, as you've mentioned, I was a co-sponsor of the law, and so it's tough to say I'm not in support of a law that I hope to pass, and that I think it's an important role for Congress to play, because frankly, it's not just about the withdrawal piece of it, it's the contributions we make towards the power of the purse still resides with the Congress. Now maybe, as if confirmed, moving towards the executive branch, I'll become I'll forget that lesson a little bit. I hope not. But ultimately, I still recognize and understand that the power of the purse is with Congress, and it's an incredibly important power. Let me point on NATO one thing. I think there's a misunderstanding about it. The NATO alliance is a very important alliance. I believe that. I believe alliances can be, and has been very useful. Without the NATO alliance, there is no end to the Cold War. In fact, without the NATO alliance, it's quite possible that much of what today, at the time, today we know as Europe, would have fallen victim to aggression. But what's important for the United States is not just to have defense allies, it's to have capable defense allies, allies who are capable of defending their region. And I think there is a question to be asked. I'm not stating a public policy position, I'm stating a question to be asked, and that is, should the role of the United States in NATO in the 21st century be the primary defense role, or as a backstop to aggression, with countries in the region assuming more of that responsibility by contributing more? Now look, in fairness, and I think the further east you move in Europe, the more money you see spent on the military as a percentage of GDP. But I think there's been broad acknowledgement across Europe and across multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that our NATO partners, these are rich, advanced economies, need to contribute more to their own defense and ultimately to the NATO partnership as well. And that's a demand that's been made by multiple presidents across the years. And the fact that that is true has been revealed by what's happened with Ukraine. Look at the ramp up in defense spending and the industrial capacity of multiple countries in Europe as a result of an armed conflict. Imagine if that capacity had been there before, it quite possibly might have had a deterrent effect as well. So I think it's important that we have alliances, but we have to have alliances with strong and capable partners. And not those who sort of have viewed the U.S. and the NATO defense agreement as an excuse to spend less on defense and more on some domestic needs. We have domestic needs too. These advanced, rich countries in Western Europe have enormous safety nets programs that they fund. We have domestic needs as well, but they've been able to divert or grow those programs because they don't have to spend as much on defense as we do as a percentage of our overall economy. And that dynamic needs to change. And I expect that President Trump will continue to forcefully make that point.
And as you know, this committee and the Senate NATO Observer Group, which I co-chair, has made that point repeatedly, and we are now up to 23 of the 32 NATO nations who are meeting their 2% of GDP, and we have a number of them who are going beyond that, and it's appropriate. And I think the sentiment on this committee would be to agree with what you're saying, but to ensure that we continue to have a strong NATO, I think will be important not only to European security, but most important to our own security. I appreciate, we talked about Ukraine. I appreciate your past leadership in supporting Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. More recently, you voted against supplemental funding for Ukraine and against forgiving loans for Ukraine in November, loans that would be critical to Ukraine's economic stability. So can you talk about how your views on Ukraine have developed and where you are now, and what you think is important for us to do in order to ensure that there is the strongest possible negotiating position if Ukraine and Russia do get to the negotiating table?
Sure. First, let me point out, and although I'll still speak to my view of the process, that I voted against that bill because I said I would not vote for a bill unless it addressed the crisis at our southern border as part of the overall arrangement. That was not done, and so I voted against it. That said, here's my view of a situation. Once this war became what we now know it is, and that is a war of attrition, a stalemate, a protracted conflict, the dynamic on that situation has changed. It has. And I believe, and I think that this echoes with the president. Let me first echo the president's words and what he said in an interview about a year ago. He was asked about the war in Ukraine. He says, I want the dying to stop. I want people to stop dying. I want the killing to stop. And frankly, I don't know how anyone could say they don't. The destruction that Ukraine is undergoing is extraordinary. It's going to take a generation to rebuild it. Millions of Ukrainians no longer live in Ukraine. And the disruption, that means how many of them are going to come back, and what are they going to come back to? Even as I speak to you now, the Ukrainian infrastructure and their energy infrastructure is being decimated in ways that are going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild over the next decades. So this is an important conflict, and I think it should be the official position of the United States that this war should be brought to an end. And the question becomes, what role can we play? And I think the first is by making that abundantly clear. And my differences with the Biden administration throughout this process is that they never clearly delineated what the end goal of the conflict was. What exactly were we funding? What exactly were we putting money towards? And on many occasions, it sounded like however much it takes for however long it takes. That is not a realistic or prudent position. The truth of the matter is that in this conflict, there is no way Russia takes all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are too brave and fight too hard, and the country is too big. That's not going to happen. It's also unrealistic to believe that somehow a nation the size of Ukraine, no matter how incompetent and no matter how much damage the Russian Federation has suffered as a result of this invasion, there's no way Ukraine is also going to push these people all the way back to where they were on the eve of the invasion, just given the size dynamic. I saw a quote recently, and I wish I could attribute to who it was, but the quote was, and I think it was very wise, where they said the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it, but this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like is it's going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor. But it's going to require bold diplomacy, and my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire, and in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States has lent itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage. Putin's goal now is to have maximum leverage so that he can basically impose neutrality on Ukraine, retrofit, and come back and do this again in 4 or 5 years. And that's not an outcome I think any of us would favor. By the same token, I think it's important that the Ukrainians have leverage, but they also will have to make concessions to reach this agreement. It's going to be very difficult. This will not be easy. Conflicts of this nature that have historical underpinnings to it are going to require a lot of hard diplomacy and tough work. But that's something that needs to happen. This conflict needs to end.
Well, I'm out of time, but I appreciate your last comment about the importance of leverage, and it's important for the United States to do what we can to help provide that leverage to Ukraine so that they can be in the best negotiating position possible with Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Senator Rubio, congratulations on your nomination to this very, very difficult job. I want to thank you for your previous service in the U.S. Senate and your willingness to take on this job should you be confirmed. And I also want to thank your family as well for their support for you to be able to be a U.S. Senator and to apply for this job as Secretary of State. And I want also to express my gratitude to all the members of the State Department. We have a lot of people who choose to serve our country overseas, spend time away from their friends and family, and I can't think of a more noble calling. You're taking over a department that's very, very important to us. On Sunday, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, said, quote, "The American people are safer and the country is better off than we were 4 years ago." Let me repeat, the American people are safer and the country is better off than 4 years ago. I don't know who believes that. I don't believe that. I think the election results demonstrate the vast majority of Americans don't believe that. We don't believe it at home. Inflation has hurt average Americans' pocketbooks. Open border policies have put Americans at risk. And I don't believe we see it overseas. In fact, Senator Rubio, should you be confirmed, you're being handed a job at a time when this country is in the most danger we've been in since World War II. It's a very dangerous time in the world, and your opening remarks demonstrate that you know that. We're not better off, and we're not safer. President Biden started this with his disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, that projected weakness, and an incomprehension of what it means to have a policy of deterrence. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine and started the largest war in Europe since World War II after that withdrawal. I believe it's because he saw weakness in this Biden administration. It's been the president's fear of helping Ukraine that has contributed to putting them in the untenable position they are today by slow rolling the weapons that Ukraine needs to be able to defend themselves. His incomprehensible and incoherent policy has caused him to handcuff American liquid natural gas exports while delaying tough sanctions on the Russian oil and gas industry, which, as you know, is the lifeblood of the Russian war machine. The Middle East is equally disastrous. Instead of enforcing sanctions on Iran, Biden naively tried to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal, enabling the regime to generate $100 billion in oil revenue. And I want to point out that during the Trump administration, because of sanctions, Iran's foreign reserves fell from $122 billion to less than $14 billion. That hampered their ability to be able to fund terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. What the Biden administration has done is allowed the Iranian regime to enrich enough weapons-grade uranium to be a week or two away from having a nuclear weapon. And since October 7th, President Biden has not supported Israel in the way he's needed. And because of the previous mentioned money that he's allowed the Iranians to have, that has funded the terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, our allies like Israel have been attacked, and we've been attacked directly. Thankfully, Israel's had the courage to stand up to these terrorists and take matters into its own hand. And it's led to the decimation of Hamas and Hezbollah. But no amount of revisionist history can change the fact that this was despite the lack of support from the Biden administration, not because of the support from the Biden administration. And of course, let's not forget North Korea and how dangerous they have become, and the fact that we are now seeing North Korean troops in Europe. A thought 4 years ago that was unthought by anybody. And of course, one of the most concerning things is Biden's weakness has emboldened the greatest adversary we have on the face of the earth right now, which is the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China is the head of the snake of this axis of dictators that are challenging the United States today. They are challenging our freedom, our security, and the very way of life we have. Beijing has had a direct hand in each of the problems I just mentioned. That's why addressing any one of them cannot be done without making sure that we are thinking about how we are deterring the People's Republic of China. When everything is a priority, nothing's a priority. And Senator Rubio, your top priority must be the People's Republic of China. Since the election in November, so this is all within the last 2 months, the PRC has hacked our Treasury Department, including CFIUS. Continue what has been described as the worst telecom hack in U.S. history. Sabotaged important undersea communication cables in Asia and Europe. Deployed ships to the South China Sea to harass our allies like the Philippines in their own territorial waters. Simulated a naval blockade of the Japanese islands for the first time. Conducted the largest naval drills in decades targeting Taiwan and the broader Western Pacific. Revealed new mobile piers suitable for a Taiwan invasion, unveiled advanced aircraft, and launched the world's largest amphibious warship. And they've allowed Iran to draw down and ship nearly 3 million barrels of oil from a storage site in China. It's obvious that Xi Jinping is positioning his chess pieces in preparation for war. He's directed his military to be prepared to take Taiwan by 2027, and folks, that's only 2 years away. Now, it's true that does not mean that he will invade in 2027, and it's also true that it's not predetermined. But it should be very concerning to all of us that he's given his military that direction. Because time and time again, dictators tell people what they're going to do, and then they go out and try and do it. The only thing that dictators respond to is force, strength, peace through strength. This was something Ronald Reagan understood a long time ago, and it's what we have to get back to in the United States. Xi Jinping is vowed to be the world-dominating power by 2049. We should take him at his word. That's what he believes he is going to try and do. It's time for us to go on the offensive and abandon illusions about what kind of adversary we're faced. This is not a managed competition. This is a competition we must win. It will take more than an all-of-government approach. It'll take an all-of-society approach to be able to win this. As our lead diplomat, Senator Rubio, you are in a position to set the tone. And that's why I can't think of a better pick to be the Secretary of State than you. So, first of all, do you agree that the PRC is the biggest threat that we face as the United States?
The Communist Party of China that leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin, there's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places, but the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went. And I think you're alluding to it in your statement. I know you may have another question. I don't want to eat up all your time, but I do want to say this. The Chinese believe that the United States are a great power in inevitable decline and that they are an inevitable rise. Now, they already are. They're going to be a rich and powerful country, and we're going to have to deal with them. The danger is that because of our own actions, in many cases, a dangerous imbalance is built up in that relationship. We allowed them for years to pretend that they were some developing country, so we should allow them to continue to cheat on trade and commerce. We should allow them to continue to expand. They lied about not militarizing and populating island chains in the South China Sea and the like. We allowed them for years, before we got serious about it, to conduct grotesque human rights violations against Uyghur Muslims, as an example. One of the most horrifying things happening on the planet. And for years, no one talked about it, which, by the way, not just has a human rights component to it, it allows them to use slave labor to produce goods that, at the expense of the rest of the world. Talk about not just a horrific humanitarian crisis, but an unfair trade practice as well. We've allowed them to get away with things. And frankly, the Chinese did what any country in the world would do given these opportunities. They took advantage of it. And so I think now we're dealing with the ramifications of it. I agree 100% what you said, but I remind you, and I remind everyone, I guess I want to make this point, that much of what we need to do to confront China is here at home. It's not just abroad, it's also here at home. We have to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity, and we have to make sure that the United States is not reliant on any single other nation for any of our critical supply chains.
And with 4 seconds left, how are you going to explain that to your average American, that we need this all-size society approach? And to your point exactly, that it needs to begin here at home, and so that people from my state, Nebraska, will understand and get on board?
If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. Everything from the blood pressure medicine we take to what movies we get to watch, and everything in between, we will depend on China for it. They have come to dominate the critical mineral industry supplies throughout the world. Everywhere in the world, they've now established critical mineral rights. Even those who want to see more electric cars, no matter where you make them, those batteries are almost entirely dependent on the ability of the Chinese and the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to produce it and export it to you. So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
Great. Thank you, Senator Rubio.
Next is Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Rubio. And I've enjoyed working with you on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which engages in many issues related to their treatment of folks from the Tibetans to the Uyghurs, to their position regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan. But let's talk about Taiwan. I had the chance to go to Taiwan in the year 2000. It was the second presidential election there, and it was the first one where people were becoming convinced that they actually might be able to hold a democracy. I believe they've earned the right to have a voice in international affairs, and I also believe that they are at great risk right now with mainland China Xi's plan to be aggressive militarily towards them, as my colleague Senator Ricketts just noted. Will you support in your role as Secretary of State Taiwan's right to have a voice in international affairs, participate in international forums? And will you support the porcupine strategy, providing that we will supply them with defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability? By the way, that phrase is from the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. It's in our current law.
Yeah, let me just point out that on the Taiwan Relation Act, and I believe of the year 2016, I was the lead Republican sponsor in reauthorizing and reinvigorating it. I think that the multiple or consecutive presidential administrations of both parties have made clear that the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is encapsulated not just in the Taiwan Relations Act, but in the 6 assurances that multiple administrations, including the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, have made clear are our policies. With regards to your second point about international forums, ASEAN is a great example of one in which that's being tested. Last year at their conference, the Chinese were able to prevent participation by the Taiwan, any mention of Taiwan in the memorandum. And then this year, they're working very hard to make sure that no one associated with Taiwan was anywhere near it. So it's just one more example of how they're being excluded. I would also point to the Western Hemisphere. I know that sounds like half a world away, but you understand this issue. The majority of nations on Earth that continue to recognize and have relations with Taiwan, the vast bulk of them, or the plurality, are within the Western Hemisphere. They've undertaken a very aggressive action in just the last 7-8 years to get these countries to flip. They got Panama to flip, then they got Panama to convince the Dominican Republic to flip. They've targeted multiple other nations, and Nicaragua most recently, to flip. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind and make a priority. And I also think it's important to recognize allies in the region like Paraguay that have not flipped, and others who have stayed strong in that regard. On the porcupine strategy, because I know it may sound weird to people, or if anyone's watching this, I know what the ratings are, but hopefully not high. But let me just say that when the porcupine strategy, what it really means is you want to make the cost of invading Taiwan higher than the benefit. We want to discourage that by the Chinese believing that, yes, could they ultimately win an invasion of Taiwan, but the price would be too high to pay. It's basically deterrence. And I think that's critical, not just to defending Taiwan, to preventing a cataclysmic military intervention in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what it would be. And I would make one more point, and again, I don't mean to want to be alarmist about it, but if you listen to Xi Jinping, and it's important when you listen to him, and I say listen, read, don't read the English translation that they put out, because the English translation is never right. You have to read the real translation on what they actually said in their native tongue. What they're basically saying is that this is a foundational and definitional issue for Xi Jinping personally. And as a result, I think we need to wrap our head around the fact that unless something dramatic changes, like an equilibrium where they conclude that the costs of intervening in Taiwan are too high, we're going to have to deal with this before the end of this decade.
Senator McCormick.
Great. Senator Rubio, good to see you again. I'm looking forward to working with you closely on many of the issues we're going to discuss today. As a senator, you've been a strong voice for American leadership, and I'm really confident you'll be a strong Secretary of State on behalf of President Trump and the American people for advancing America's interest. I believe you're the right man for the job. When we met privately, we talked about a range of topics, from China to Israel to the fate of the hostages in Gaza to energy policy. We also talked about something that hits home here in Pennsylvania for my constituents, which is the fate of Mark Fogel. As you and I discussed, Mark has been imprisoned by the Russians since 2021. I've had a chance to meet with his mom, 95-year-old Mafa. She was at the Butler rally with myself and President Trump in the front row when he was shot. We need to bring him home. It took far too long for the State Department to designate Mark as wrongfully detained by the Russian government, and was really a gut punch to many of us in Pennsylvania that Mark wasn't included in the swap last year. So, Senator, will you commit to working with me and others in our delegation to make Mark's return home a high priority?
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been involved already. I've met with those families as well. We've had conversations about this. And there are two things I'd point to. Number one, this is a ridiculous case. I mean, this is an American that clearly there was an order given at some level that if you see an American and you have anything you can charge them with, let's charge them and let's collect these because we can trade them in the future for something. There's a global market for this now. And it's one of the challenges of the 21st century. There is now an active global market for detaining Americans wrongfully in Venezuela, in Russia, in China, or somewhere else, Iran, and then using them to trade for something they want in the future. And so I think there needs to be greater awareness put out about that reality. Although people are still going to travel, and Americans are still a free people that have the ability to travel, this is a real risk. In this particular case, this has nothing to do with politics. No one can claim, nor do they, that he's a spy or that he's involved in a national security threat. And so this is a case that has to be elevated, and hopefully one that can be done through strong private diplomacy, at a minimum as a goodwill gesture. Because if they're not willing to do this, then not to mention the broader challenges posed to us by what Putin is doing in Ukraine, then I think the chances of improvement in U.S.-Russian relations are impossible. But this is not that this would solve that problem, but it is at a minimum the kind of thing you would hope to see if anyone is serious about improving relations, especially if we can get the situation in Ukraine to a peaceful standing. And I hope that this case will be one that we can reach a good result on.
Good. Thank you. On the sad topic of hostages, as you know, Dean and I, my wife, live in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. We've been part of a meeting with hostages in Israel and in the United States as recently as last week. Noah Aragami and Ronan and Orna Nutra, who lost their son, sadly, Omer, recently came to visit. And, President Trump said recently that all hell will be to pay if the hostages aren't released. if confirmed, what emphasis would you put on releasing those hostages in Gaza? Do you agree that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza absolutely must include the release of those hostages?
Well, it must include it, because if it doesn't, there won't be a ceasefire for long. I mean, the Israeli commitment to bringing back their civilians, that's what these are. These are civilians. These are people, these are innocent people who were targeted and have been held in horrifying conditions, the health and well-being of which many of them we still don't know, but we believe there's a substantial number that are going to be released as part of this first tranche. And that's an important point as well, in regard to this agreement that has now been publicly reported on. It's not everyone. I think there's a first tranche of women, children, and people over a certain age, and then a second tranche of releases of males that are of military age, who they claim are all combatants, even though they are not. They just happen to be of a certain age. But without the hostage situation resolved, this situation will not be resolved. It is the linchpin of what's happened now. Hamas has been severely degraded, but these people, that include a number of American citizens, need to be home as soon as possible, and that will remain a priority in any engagement that we're involved in with regards to not just a ceasefire, but some permanent peace process moving forward.
Very good, thank you. Since October 7th, there's been a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism, pro-terrorist violence in our cities, on college campuses. You and I had the opportunity to write an op-ed together. And in that op-ed, we called on foreign nationals who support Hamas or other terrorist organizations to lose their visas and to be sent back to their home countries. As Secretary of State, of course, you'll be responsible for overseeing the issuance of visas. How will you enforce our laws to ensure that we remove supporters of terrorist groups from our country?
Listen, my view on this is one of common sense. Okay? If you apply for a visa to come into the United States, and in the process of being looked at, it comes to light that you're a supporter of Hamas, we wouldn't let you in. If we knew you were a supporter of Hamas, we would not give you a visa. So now that you got the visa and you're inside the U.S., and now we realize you're a supporter of Hamas, we should remove your visa. If you could not come in because you're a supporter of Hamas, you should not be able to stay on a visa if you're a supporter of Hamas. That's how I view it. And I think that's just an issue of common sense. And we intend to be very forceful about that.
Good, thank you. Fentanyl is killing 4,000 Pennsylvanians each year, over 200 Americans a day. President Trump campaigned on this throughout the country, in Pennsylvania, as did I, on we have to stop that flow of fentanyl. And of course, violent criminal groups in Mexico, including the Jalisco and Sinaloa cartels, terrorize our communities here at home with this deadly fentanyl, and the Mexican people with endless violence. As Secretary, will you initiate the process to designate these groups, these cartels, as foreign terrorist organizations? And if so, can you describe for the American people the national security tools that unlocks, that designation unlocks, to degrade the cartels?
Well, first of all, the designation of a designated foreign terrorist organization brings with it a host of things. It makes it illegal to cooperate or work with them in any way, or to be supportive of their endeavors. It cuts off access to all sorts of banking opportunities and the like around the world where it's important to move money around. Now, that said, it's probably an imperfect tool when it comes to these groups that you're discussing, because these are sophisticated criminal enterprises. They are terrorizing the United States, but they are sophisticated criminal enterprises, and they operate in the trafficking of people, drugs, and migrants to horrifying effect. Sadly, they also have basically operational control over huge swaths of the border regions between Mexico and the United States. That's just an unfortunate fact, and it's one we're going to have to confront with our partners in Mexico, is that these sophisticated transnational terroristic organizations have operational and functional control over huge swaths of areas that border the United States of America. And so whether that is the tool that we use, which is maybe the appropriate one, or some new one that we come up with, it is important for us not just to go after these groups, but to identify them and call them for what they are, and that is terroristic in their nature, because they are terrorizing America with mass migration and with a flow of drugs.
What about military force?
Well, that's an option the president has at his disposal. Obviously, it's not one that is in the purview of the Department of State. I think President Trump is someone that never publicly discusses his options and leaves himself the flexibility to act. I think there's a lot we can and will continue to do in close partnership with our allies in Mexico. I think there's more they can do as well to confront this challenge. And my preference would be From the Department of State's perspective, my preference would be that we can work with the Mexicans on this issue cooperatively, because it is impacting their nation as much as ours. These sophisticated groups, these criminal organizations, don't simply threaten America, they threaten the Mexican political process. In the last election, you had multiple presidential candidates and other candidates to other offices assassinated. You've had journalists targeted and assassinated for speaking out against these groups. So these groups don't simply terrorize the United States, they're terrorizing and in some ways undermining the Mexican government and Mexican sovereignty and the health and well-being of the Mexican people. And so my hope, in a perfect world, is that we could work in close collaboration with Mexican authorities to take these groups out.
Very good. Thank you. Final question. The Chinese Communist Party, as you said in your testimony, has waged a deliberate campaign of economic warfare against the United States and our allies. We need to restore, as President Trump has said, reciprocity in that economic relationship and impose cost on Beijing for hurting American workers. How can the United States counter that campaign? How do you think about the economic tools that the administration can apply to cut off the flow of American capital and technology that supports China's geopolitical ambitions?
Well, and again, much of what it comes to trade and so forth in this administration will be handled through the Department of Commerce, but we'll certainly have an economic undersecretary and a whole entire bureaus that will be dedicated to what we can contribute to that endeavor. So I'll just share my views broadly on it. Number one, I think it would make common sense to everybody that if by and large, a relationship in which their companies can do whatever they want here, but we can't do it there, is a pretty unfair relationship. And it's something we've allowed in the past for allied countries who are small, poor, and developing. That cannot continue, in my view, and I think that's the president's view. The second is, there's much that needs to be done with regards here domestically. I think we once again as a nation, this is not a Department of State issue, but once again as a nation need to prioritize the importance of our industrial capacity and our access to supply chains domestically, especially in key and critical industries. Maybe not every industry, but some key industries. We should either have a domestic capacity or an allied capacity that's reliable and can't be used against us in a moment of conflict as leverage. The third point I would make is we need to be actively engaged in the world. As an example, the Chinese own significant mineral rights and mining rights in Argentina, in Chile, throughout Africa. It's one of the reasons why the polar region and the Arctic region has become so critical as well in that regard, is because they are scooping up all over the world these mineral rights, port rights, etc., that place us at an enormous disadvantage in the long term. And it's what I said in that short answer is, if this trend continues, we are going to wind up living in a world where much of what we depend on for our security, our health, our safety, and our economic prosperity will largely depend on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. And that cannot be a world that we leave for our children.
Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Congratulations to you and to our ranking member. Look forward to working with you both. Mr. Zeldin, it's great to see you. Thank you for accepting this nomination, appearing before this committee. I enjoyed serving with you in the U.S. House and look forward to serving with you in your new role at EPA. I also want to extend my warmest welcome to your family. I want to start with a very, very fundamental question and give you an example. The question is it your job as EPA administrator to follow the science or follow the law? Here's the question associated with that question. Clean Power Plan 2.0 has rules associated with it that run afoul of the Supreme Court's ruling in West Virginia versus EPA. So as administrator, will you follow the law, both in statute and as interpreted by the Supreme Court?
Senator, on every situation, if confirmed as EPA administrator, my first obligation will always be to follow my obligations under the law.
With regard to goals and clean air, is the goal to have clean air, or is the goal to eliminate specific fuels?
the goal, the reason why a regulation might be in place is the end state of wanting to have the cleanest, safest, healthiest air, drinking water. That is the goal, the end state of all the conversations that we might have, any regulations that might get passed, any laws that might get passed by Congress. What brings us all together should be the ultimate goal of having clean air and clean water.
That is my goal as well, and I look forward to working with you to accomplish that goal. I spent 4 days in October in Silicon Valley, mostly meeting with firms that are developing artificial intelligence. If the U.S. is to be the leader in developing AI, we need abundant energy, and it has to be baseload energy. The demands of artificial intelligence for energy are going to be extraordinary. And so our goal, as you and I agree, is to provide that additional abundant energy so the United States can remain the leader in the world on the development of artificial intelligence, provide that additional energy in the cleanest way possible. And in some instances, that may involve finding the absolute cleanest way to continue to use fossil fuels. I want to point out to you, if you look at how clean natural gas is in the United States compared to other countries and compared to other sources of energy, you'll be stunned at how clean it is. Yet, sometimes this panel and others tend to lump all fossil fuels together and assume that they cannot be provided as part of the energy baseload in this country in a clean way. I'd like to invite you to Wyoming so we can show you that there are ways that fossil fuel can be used and that carbon capture and sequestration can be used to help include all types of fuels in developing the energy this country needs in order to be artificial intelligence leader of the world. Now, I have another question with regard to small refineries. Thank you for indulging that editorial comment. Are you aware that there are more than 100 petitions for hardship relief that remain to be decided by EPA, some dating back more than 5 years with regard to small refineries? And if confirmed, can we work together to outline an expedient timeline for reaching decisions?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. I want to include a couple of other questions that I think are of significance with regard to PFAS. And I'm running between 2 hearings, so excuse me if I'm being repetitive. Do you plan to ensure that EPA's policies are effective while protecting passive receivers from lawsuits and consumers with unreasonably high utility bills? And let me explain here. The Biden administration's plan to designate legacy PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA can impose liability on entities like municipal water systems that did not produce or knowingly handle these chemicals. So these entities are called passive receivers. I know that it's true at airports. They have PFAS issues as well. And so these passive receivers are now vulnerable to lawsuits that literally could bankrupt small local governments across the nation. My concern is that, of course, we address PFAS issues, but not in a way that submits small local municipal water systems and airports to litigation.
Senator, thank you for raising this issue, and I've heard it from your colleagues on this committee on both sides of the aisle during my meetings. It's something that is a big issue to you, and it will therefore be a big issue for me. And I also saw it in my home county of Suffolk County, where we had PFAS issues. The passive receiver issue is something where it could get passed down to the consumer, where they end up paying for the cleanup costs in a way that we need to be cognizant of at the EPA.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm sorry I ran over.
No, good. I am pleased to welcome one of our newer members, Senator Also Brooks, and I would welcome you and remind you that you have very large shoes to fill with Senator Cardin leaving from the great state of Maryland, and I'm sure you'll be able to do that. So welcome, and it's great to have you on committee.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to just say thank you so much to Chairwoman Capito and Ranking Member Whitehouse for your leadership on this committee and for holding today's hearing. I agree with you that we miss Senator Ben Cardin, but I am excited to be able to join this committee. EPW has jurisdiction over many issues that are important to Marylanders, and I look forward to working with both of you as well as all of our colleagues on this committee to address the environmental and infrastructure challenges that we face in our states. To Mr. Zeldin, congratulations again to you and to your family on your nomination, and thank you as well for your willingness to serve and for appearing before our committee today. I appreciate it. I very much enjoyed meeting with you and having the opportunity to speak with you. And so I suspect that my questions will come as no surprise to you based on that conversation. And in the interest of time here, I'd ask that as much as possible that you would answer yes or no to the following questions. Now, while in Congress, you work to ensure that EPA's efforts to restore the Long Island Sound were successful, including advocating for federal funding. Like Long Island Sound in New York and Connecticut, the Chesapeake Bay is an economic driver in Maryland and across the Bay watershed. The Bay is the nation's largest estuary and is one of the most productive fisheries in the United States. And so I ask you whether you would agree that restoring and protecting our nation's estuaries and watersheds is a shared responsibility between the states and the federal government.
Yes, Senator.
Furthermore, if confirmed, will you advocate for robust federal funding for regional restoration efforts across the country, including the Chesapeake Bay and for the National Estuary Program?
Yes, Senator. Ultimately, it will be up to Congress to decide on funding levels, and it'll be my obligation to make sure that money is spent to Congress's intent.
Thank you. Now, the EPA has said that no amount of lead in drinking water is safe. And lead in drinking water is particularly dangerous for children. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which you oppose as a member of Congress, made historic down payments on lead pipe replacement to ensure that communities across America have access to safe drinking water from lead contamination. If confirmed, will you build on the success of the bipartisan infrastructure law and support additional funding for lead pipe replacement?
Senator, yes to the same answer as my last question. Ultimately, it's going to be up to Congress to decide what the policy is, what the law is, what the funding level is. My commitment and my obligation will be to make sure that funding is spent to Congress's intent as laid out in those appropriations.
But you recognize that lead in water is a problem, particularly for children.
Yes, Senator.
And would you be able to commit to not cutting funding that would aid in replacement of these lead pipes?
Senator, if confirmed as administrator of the EPA, won't be cutting any funding. That's a decision as far as funding levels for Congress to set. Whatever funding level Congress decides upon is going to be the letter that is going to be the number that I am committed to fulfill my obligation of being a good steward of the tax dollars and spend to Congress's intent.
Okay. Now, the unofficial Department of Government Efficiency led by Elon Musk has proposed laying off 75% of government workers. Across the federal government, their plan would result in more than 1.7 million civilian employees being laid off, including almost 500,000 veterans. If the Trump administration follows through on this proposal, that would mean more than 12,000 employees at the EPA would be laid off, and many of these are hardworking, dedicated public servants who live in Maryland. Do you support firing 75% of EPA employees?
Senator, offhand, I'm not even aware of a single person being fired during the first Trump administration at the EPA. That's not the same for other agencies. And by the way, there might have been someone. I'm just, I haven't been told about it. I want to make sure that my job as EPA administrator is to increase productivity, is to make sure that we are efficient and accountable and transparent, that we are to you, not just myself as administrator, but our entire team, for us to be in the office, collaborative and productive.
All right, in a similar vein, I'd ask you about another issue, and that is moving EPA headquarters outside of Washington, D.C., and wonder whether or not you agree with that effort and the effort of moving them out of Washington, D.C., or whether you would oppose it.
Senator, no one has expressed to me in any setting since I was announced as nominee or before that of any plans with regards to moving the EPA headquarters out of D.C. I have not been involved in any conversation. I'm not aware of any conversation.
That's the time I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.